It started with something so small it was almost invisible. A woman bent down quietly and sprinkled a thin line of salt across the threshold of her front door. The grains clung to the cracks in the stone, catching the morning light like frost. Most people passing by barely noticed. Those who did, they laughed. Superstition, someone muttered. Old wives' tale, another scoffed. But the woman never looked up. She pressed the last pinch of salt down gently with her thumb, as if sealing something unseen. Why would anyone do that? Just a line, just salt. And yet, there's something about it that lingers. It stays with you, even if you don't believe in rituals, even if you think you've outgrown stories. Because deep down, we all know some boundaries aren't made of wood or stone. Some defenses are spiritual. And sometimes, it's the smallest acts that carry the weight of generations. The door is a border, the threshold a liminal space, and the salt? The salt is a silent sentinel. What if we told you this tiny act hides a truth so ancient, so symbolic, and so piercingly relevant that once you learn it, you'll never look at salt the same way again? Before we unravel the layers, let's pause, right now. Think about your own life, your home, your mind, your heart. What invisible line do you wish you had drawn earlier? What kind of boundary might have spared you disappointment, danger, or regret? Leave a comment right now. The boundary I wish I had set. And if you're willing, complete the sentence. Why? Because reflection is the first ritual. And maybe, just maybe, your story will spark someone else's awakening. But don't be fooled. This isn't just about metaphors. The salt line is real. The wisdom is real. And the purpose is sharper than you imagine. You're about to uncover a symbol so persistent in Jewish tradition that it appears in ancient offerings, sacred pacts, and everyday life. A substance chosen not just for its taste, but for its truth. A truth that resists rot, that refuses to fade, that purifies, preserves, and protects. So why salt? Why not sand, or ash, or stone? Because salt doesn't just symbolize endurance, it is endurance. It survives. It seeps into the essence of whatever it touches. And more importantly, in the hands of tradition, it becomes holy. Still think it's odd? Keep watching, because the further we go, the clearer it gets. The act that once seemed strange is the act that just might save you. Salt isn't just seasoning. In Jewish tradition, it's a symbol carved deep into the bones of spiritual life, ancient, essential, and sacred. From the first books of Torah to the rituals still practiced today, salt is never just for flavor. It's a message, a reminder, a covenant. In Leviticus, salt appears not in the kitchen, but on the altar. Every grain offering brought to God, the text commands, must be seasoned with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking. Leviticus 2:13. Imagine that. Even in sacrifice, even in something as solemn as offering atonement, God wanted salt. Not gold, not wine, salt. Why? Because salt doesn't spoil. It preserves, it binds, it endures, just like the promises of heaven were meant to. The sages didn't overlook this detail. The rabbis saw salt as a metaphor for the eternal nature of divine truth. In their commentary, they explained, fire consumes, flesh decays, but salt remains. It doesn't rot, it protects against corruption. In every offering, salted, a whisper of eternity was added. In the Jewish table rituals, salt is there too. When bread is broken during Shabbat dinner, it is dipped in salt before the first bite. This isn't for taste. It's a miniature altar, a reenactment of sacrifice turned celebration. The table becomes a sanctuary. The salt, a symbol of covenant kept, even in times of peace. And it doesn't end there. Salt was used in ancient purification rites. It was sprinkled on the temple stairs. It was kept in homes, not just to cook with, but to symbolize divine presence, to remind the household that every space could be holy. But perhaps most striking of all is how ordinary salt is. Not rare, not luxurious. It's in every home, on every table, affordable, accessible. And that's exactly why it was chosen, because God's presence, like salt, belongs everywhere, not just in temples, not just in prayers.
But in the everyday, the symbolism deepens when we remember salt only works by dissolving. It gives itself fully to whatever it's added to. It disappears, but leaves everything changed. Isn't that what love is supposed to do? Isn't that what faith is meant to be? And so the salt line at the entrance isn't random. It isn't superstition. It's a declaration. A quiet one, but no less bold. It says, "This home remembers. This home belongs to a covenant that doesn't spoil. This home has been seasoned by something greater." Now imagine someone crossing that threshold unaware, stepping across a silent line drawn not for them, but against what they might carry. Still think it's just a sprinkle? Or are you starting to feel the weight of what's beneath your feet? Not every ritual shouts. Some whisper. Some begin with a movement so small it escapes the eye, but stirs something deep in the spirit.
The power of subtle rituals lies precisely in their quietness. And in Jewish life, these rituals aren't decorative, they are anchors. Lighting the Shabbat candles isn't just about ambiance, it's about declaring that time has changed. Washing hands before bread isn't about hygiene, it's about elevating a meal into a sacred act. Tying tzitzit to the corners of a garment isn't style, it's a constant reminder of divine instruction woven into your daily steps. And so it is with the salt. The line of salt at the entrance might seem like nothing more than superstition if you glance too fast. But stop. Look again. That thin, quiet mark is doing what all holy rituals do: separating, defining, holding space. Because life needs boundaries, not just to keep danger out, but to remind you of who you are on the inside. The moment you cross a threshold, physically or spiritually, you shift.
You become guest or host, outsider or insider, seeker or keeper. The salt line makes this shift conscious. It's a subtle ritual that changes the atmosphere. Rabbis have long taught that entrances matter. A doorway isn't just a break in the wall, it's a transition point. That's why mezuzot are placed on the frames, why blessings are said when entering or leaving rooms of significance, why the act of crossing is treated with respect. You don't just walk through, you pass into. The salt line, then, is another form of this mindfulness. One step, and you're reminded. This place is guarded. This space has intention. There's power in the repetition of such gestures, in tracing the same line each morning, and repeating the same whisper of protection or intention. These rituals shape the day before it begins. They shape you. And unlike loud declarations, they don't need to convince anyone else.
Subtle rituals don't perform, they transform. They're not about magic, they're about memory. Because every time you make the motion, sprinkle, bless, protect, you're choosing to live with consciousness. You're saying, my life has a rhythm, my home has meaning, my actions are not accidental. And in a world constantly pulling us into noise, distraction, and forgetfulness, that quiet choice might be the most radical thing you can do. So the next time you see someone draw a salt line, or light a candle, or kiss a mezuzah, don't dismiss it as quaint. You're witnessing the resistance of the soul, and the more subtle it looks, the more sacred it might be. But this specific ritual, this line of salt at the entrance, where did it really come from? Who first drew it? Why did they believe in it so fiercely? To answer that, we need to go back, further than you expect. Long before doorbells, before alarm systems, before cameras and emotion sensors, there was salt. Not just in kitchens, but at thresholds, lining entrances, guarding doorways. Passed down from generation to generation, the practice may seem obscure now, but its roots are tangled deep in both mysticism and memory. To trace it, we journey into the blurred space between folklore and faith, where stories whispered and candlelight become maps to something greater. Some scholars trace the salt line to early Jewish mysticism, specifically Kabbalistic traditions that saw salt as a material both of the earth and yet incorruptible by it. Salt couldn't rot. Demons, spirits, and dark forces, they believed, were drawn to decay. Salt repelled them, not by force, but by its very nature.
In communities across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, mothers and grandmothers would sprinkle salt around cradles, under beds, and most notably, across the threshold, to keep the evil eye from entering, they'd say. But more than superstition, this was protection born from generations of survival, of knowing that life was fragile, and that the spiritual world bled into the physical far more than modern minds like to admit. There are stories of rabbis in Morocco marking salt lines during times of unrest. In Yemenite Jewish homes, elders would trace salt around windows when sensing danger. In parts of Persia, salt was poured across entrances during births and funerals, liminal moments when souls pass between worlds. And always, the line of salt stood like a silent sentinel. This was not about fear. It was about remembrance. The salt marked the edge where chaos could not cross,
where fear was met with faith. But the practice wasn't exclusive to Jews. In ancient Rome, soldiers carried salt as part of their pay, salarium, the root of our word salary. They believed salt preserved not just food, but courage. Across cultures, from African to Slavic, from Japanese to Celtic, salt has been used to purify, to bless, to protect. So why did the salt line endure specifically in Jewish custom? Because in Jewish life, physical acts carry spiritual weight. Every object can become sacred through intention, and every tradition, no matter how simple, is layered with meaning. The line at the door became more than a folk custom. It was a statement. We draw the line here, between holiness and harm, between memory and forgetting, between our world and what lies outside. When persecution came, and it often did, the salt was still placed, quietly, without fanfare.
Because even in the darkest times, people believed the line could hold. Sometimes the salt was swept away, sometimes it stayed, but the act of placing it, that was the real power. The courage to draw it, the memory behind it, the faith that even if the world forgets, you won't. And perhaps that's the most important boundary of all. But what exactly are these boundaries protecting? And why does it matter now, more than ever? A boundary is not a wall. It's a choice. And in Jewish wisdom, boundaries aren't built to imprison, but to protect. Not to keep people out, but to keep what's sacred in. The line of salt at the entrance, it's more than tradition. It's a quiet declaration. Not everything belongs here. Not every energy, not every influence, not every fear. In a world that constantly demands access to your time, your space, your peace, the salt line reminds you, some doors must remain shut. Jewish thought has always valued boundaries. They exist not just in space, but in time. Shabbat is a boundary in the week. Kosher laws are boundaries in what we consume. The rules of speech, Lashon Hara, are boundaries over the tongue. Each is a form of discipline, a circle drawn not to exclude, but to protect the soul from being diluted, corrupted, exhausted. The Talmud says, if there is no boundary, there is no life. And nowhere is this more literal than the entrance to the home. Because the home, in Jewish tradition, is not just a residence, it's a micro-sanctuary, a place where divine presence, Shekhinah, can dwell, a sacred container for love, memory, study, and rest. But that holiness doesn't protect itself. It requires intention. That's why mezuzot are placed on doorposts, with scrolls of Torah inside, to guard and to remind. That's why some say prayers before entering or leaving. That's why the salt line, though quiet, even secret, is so powerful. It's a line between the chaos of the outside world and the peace you try to preserve inside. And the truth is, we all need that line now more than ever. With digital life seeping into every moment, with news cycles that never sleep, with voices and expectations demanding constant reaction, the soul craves a protected space. What if you had a ritual, however small, that told your spirit, you're safe now, you've crossed into peace? What if one line of salt became your anchor? What if it reminded you, day after day, that you are not obligated to absorb everything the world throws at you?
that your home, your mind, your heart can be sacred ground. The boundary isn't to isolate, it's to preserve, to filter.
To protect the parts of you that the world can't see but desperately needs to survive. And that's why the salt matters. That's why the placement matters. Because at the threshold of every home, every heart, there comes a choice. Will you let everything in? Or will you draw the line, lovingly but firmly, and say, only what serves peace may enter? Salt isn't loud. It doesn't shout or strike. It settles. It clings. It holds the line. And it reminds you, each time you step over it, that boundaries aren't barriers, they are blessings. But the salt's significance goes deeper still. It's not just about space, it's about promise. It's about pacts that cannot be broken. Covenants are sacred. They are not contracts to be negotiated, altered, or revoked. In Jewish thought, a covenant, brit, is eternal, and salt of all things was chosen to represent that. Why? Because salt doesn't die.
It doesn't decay. It doesn't rust, rot, or vanish. It remains. In the Torah, God calls it a covenant of salt, a phrase that appears not once, but twice. First in the book of Leviticus 2:13, and again in Numbers 18:19, where God declares, "It is a covenant of salt forever before the Lord with you and your descendants." This isn't metaphor. It's an invitation to see the eternal through the everyday. When salt is sprinkled on the altar, it's not about seasoning, it's about sealing. The offering becomes bound to something bigger than the moment. It becomes part of a bond stretching back to Sinai and forward into forever. In Jewish law, salt is required in every sacrificial meal offering, no exception, because the covenant must be preserved, not just in word, but in ritual. And salt, being incorruptible, was the chosen witness to that permanence.
Even the Hebrew word for salt, melach, shares roots with the word melakah, meaning labor or sacred work. Salt then becomes the work of the covenant, the daily effort to preserve holiness in a world that is constantly breaking it down. Imagine that, every grain a keeper of sacred history. This makes the salt line at the door even more profound. It isn't just an act of protection, it's a renewal of promise, a silent whisper. The covenant still holds. The sacred endures here. It's easy to forget. In a world of broken promises, fragile trust, shifting loyalties, who believes in unbreakable bonds anymore? But the salt line says, we do. We believe in the kind of loyalty that lasts, in the kind of memory that refuses to fade, in the kind of faith that doesn't dissolve even under pressure. Some families place salt in little dishes in each room, reminders of that bond.
Others mix it with water to purify a space. But the line at the door? That's different. That's visible, intentional, and ancient. And it's not just about our promises to God, it's about God's promise to us. That no matter how chaotic the world becomes, there is still something eternal, something pure, something that holds. That's what the salt protects. That's what the line declares. And every time someone crosses that threshold, whether with clean intentions or dark ones, they pass over a symbol older than time. They cross a covenant. And what happens next depends on what they carry. Because sometimes that salt doesn't just hold memory, it responds. And when it does, it leaves no doubt that you've stepped into something sacred. But what does all this mean for us now, in a world that feels so far from the ancient temple, so far from altars and offerings? More than you think. Because the salt line still speaks, especially today. In a world overflowing with distractions, the ancient ritual of sprinkling salt across a doorway feels almost defiant. It's not a trend. It's not optimized for likes. It doesn't shout for attention. And yet, its message cuts deeper than most headlines ever will. Because today, perhaps more than ever, we are desperate for boundaries. The salt line, in its simplicity, teaches what modern life so often forgets, that not everything belongs in every space, that your home is not a hallway for the world's chaos, that you don't have to be available, accessible, and exposed at all times. We've blurred the lines. Phones bring strangers into our bedrooms. Work emails slip into our dinner tables. Bad news floods our peace before we've even had coffee. But the salt, quiet, ancient, constant, whispers, "You can draw the line."
In Jewish thought, every home is a kind of sanctuary. The sages taught that when the temple was destroyed, the holiness didn't vanish, it scattered into dining tables, into doorways, into the everyday acts of a mindful life. And so placing a line of salt across your entrance today may seem outdated, but in truth, it's revolutionary. It's reclaiming the threshold. It's reminding yourself that before anyone else decides what enters your life, you do. Some still perform this ritual during moments of transition, after moving into a new home, during illness, after an argument, before a wedding. Times when energy feels unstable, when the spirit craves anchoring. It's not about superstition, it's about intention. Salt doesn't just repel, it reflects. It reflects your right to peace, your power to choose what crosses your boundaries, physically, emotionally, spiritually.
Imagine starting your day with that act. Just a line, a moment, a decision. And over time, the salt begins to work not just on the space, but on you. It reminds you that the sacred is not found in loud declarations, but in quiet resistance. That ancient wisdom still has a place in modern rooms. It's not about going backwards, it's about remembering forward. Remembering that your home is holy, not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. Because you love in it, cry in it, heal in it. Because your children grow inside it. Because your thoughts unfold there. And if something matters that much, it deserves protection. A digital password guards your inbox. A lock guards your door. Why not something to guard your soul? That's what the salt does. It's not magic, it's memory. It's not superstition, it's selection.
And in an age that wants to break every boundary, the most sacred act might be to draw one. To draw it clearly, intentionally, daily if needed. And if you're still not convinced that a little salt can make such a difference, wait until you hear the stories. Real ones. Ones that left skeptics speechless and believers in tears. There's a story whispered from a small village in Eastern Europe. A fire had broken out in the middle of the night, swift, brutal, devouring everything in its path. Homes crumbled, trees crackled, the town square turned to ash. But one house, standing near the heart of it all, remained untouched. Not a single scorch mark on its door, not a puff of smoke inside, just stillness, while all around burned. The firefighters said it was luck. Others said the wind had changed. But the neighbors? They remembered. That family was old, faithful.
And every Friday before sunset, the grandmother would sprinkle a fine line of salt across the doorway. Always the same words on her lips. No darkness shall pass where covenant holds. She'd been mocked for it once. What's a little salt going to do against the world? Someone had asked. After the fire, no one asked again. Stories like this don't show up in textbooks. They don't need to. They live in memory, in ritual, in repetition. There's the tale of a young couple in Jerusalem, barely making ends meet. Their neighborhood had been facing a wave of robberies. Every night, someone new was hit. Locks broken, drawers emptied, hearts shattered. One evening, just before bed, the husband, an immigrant from Iraq, remembered something his grandmother used to do. He didn't fully believe in it, but out of desperation, he sprinkled a line of salt at the front and back door. That night, their block was hit again, but their house, untouched. The thief later confessed. "I don't know why," he said. "Something told me not to enter that one." Coincidence? Perhaps. But that's not how faith works. Faith doesn't need proof. It only needs memory and meaning. Another story, this one more recent. A woman, emotionally shattered from years of spiritual numbness, started reading about old Jewish customs. One line struck her. Salt is the reminder of an unbroken promise. That night, she sprinkled a line of salt at her apartment door. Not for protection, not for magic, but for healing. The next morning, she didn't feel safe. She felt seen. "I remembered," she later said, "that even if the world had forgotten me,
the covenant hadn't. Sometimes the salt guards the house. Sometimes it guards the heart. These stories aren't about miracles. They're about moments. Moments when the spiritual world gently reveals its hand. Subtle, soft, but unmistakable. And for every story told, dozens remain unspoken. Not because they didn't happen, but because those who lived them know some things are too sacred to share widely. But if you listen closely, to the elders, to the quiet ones, to the keepers of tradition, you'll hear them. You'll hear about what salt has seen, what salt has stopped, what salt has saved. And you might start to wonder, what might your line of salt prevent? Or perhaps more powerfully, what might it invite in? He laughed. That's how it always starts in these stories. The skeptic, the rationalist, the one who looks at ancient rituals and sees only dust. Eli was a self-described realist. Raised in tradition, yes, but trained to believe only what could be measured, proven, controlled. When his wife suggested sprinkling salt at their apartment door after a strange, heavy feeling began to linger in the house, he smirked. "We need a better lock," he said, "not a pantry ritual." But she did it anyway, quietly, respectfully. A line of salt, one Friday evening, laid straight across the entrance with a short prayer. She didn't even tell him. That weekend, Eli had a dream. He stood at the threshold of their home, and something, he didn't know what, tried to push past him. He couldn't see its face, only a presence. But when it reached the salt line, it stopped. Not violently, just halted. He woke up sweating. Still, he said nothing. Just coincidence, just sleep. But the dream came again, and again. And on the third night, when he jolted awake with a taste of fear in his mouth, he found her already sitting up. "I knew you'd feel it eventually," she said.
That moment changed him. Not into a zealot, not into a mystic, but into something far more powerful. A man who no longer mocked what he didn't understand. Skepticism isn't evil. It guards against gullibility. But arrogance? That's different. That's what rituals like the salt line pierce through, not to shame, but to awaken. There's a famous teaching from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. The salt line carries that weight. It says, even if you don't understand, you can still respect. Even if you don't believe yet, you can still act. Another skeptic story. A young university student, sarcastic and sharp, mocked her grandmother's superstitions every time she visited. But after a traumatic break-in at her dorm, she found herself calling that same grandmother at midnight. "What was that thing you used to do with the salt?" she whispered.
There was silence on the other end. Then, "You're ready now." It's not about manipulation. It's about timing. Sometimes it takes fear to make us open again. Sometimes it takes something unexplainable to remind us that not everything true needs explanation. And when that moment comes, when the skeptic crosses over into reverence, it's not a defeat, it's a return to wonder, to humility, to something older than certainty. Because faith doesn't always begin with belief. Sometimes it begins with need. And when the salt holds the line, when the impossible becomes undeniable, it doesn't scream, "I told you so." It simply shines, white, silent, waiting. And as more and more skeptics become quiet believers, one truth rises. The salt doesn't need to convince. It just needs to be placed. And the rest always comes. But if you think this story ends with belief, you're wrong.
The line leads somewhere else, something deeper, something final. At first, it was just salt, a sprinkle, a line, a gesture. But by the end, it becomes something else entirely, revelation. Because the true power of the salt line isn't in superstition, it's not in magic, it's not even in defense. It's in remembering that you belong to something, that you are part of a people who have survived exile, fire, war, and forgetting, not by might, but by memory. And memory needs ritual. The salt line is not an ending, it's a threshold. Every time you draw it, you are crossing into awareness. You are stepping into a home, not just built with walls, but with wisdom. You are claiming your space, physical and spiritual, as sacred ground. And if you followed this journey, through the symbols, the stories, the skeptics, and the sacred, you now understand. The smallest act can carry the greatest weight.
Because what is salt, really? It's simple. It's everywhere. It's in your kitchen, your sweat, your tears. It's in the ocean. It's in your body. It's survival itself. And when placed with intention, it becomes a spiritual agent, a bridge between the ordinary and the divine. This is Jewish wisdom, that the holiest truths are never far away. They are in your hand, in your breath, in the ground beneath your feet. Salt teaches this. It preserves memory. It declares boundaries. It protects what matters. And it binds us to God, to each other, to history. So next time you see someone quietly tracing a line across their door, you'll know it's not odd. It's sacred. It's the line between chaos and peace, between exile and home, between forgetting and remembering. And maybe, you'll start doing it too. Not because you're superstitious, but because you're awake.
Awake to the idea that every space can be made holy, that not everything must be visible to be powerful, that some wisdom is passed through silence, through action, through grains of salt. And maybe one day, when your child asks what you're doing at the door, you'll kneel down, take the salt in your hand and say, "This is how we remember who we are." Because at the heart of all true tradition is one great lesson. If even salt has a purpose, then so do you. If even salt can hold the line, then so can you. And if something so small can protect something so sacred, then imagine what your presence can do. So draw the line, bless the threshold, guard the light, and never forget what the salt has always known. Holiness isn't found in big things. It's found in small acts done with meaning, over time, again and again, until they become who you are.
If this story stirred something in you, share it, like it, and drop a comment with your city or country. Let's show how far this wisdom travels, because some lines connect, even across the world.